My name is Lynne Viola. I'm a university professor at the University of Toronto, and I'm a historian of modern Russia and Ukraine. I am publishing a book in the fall called Stalinist Perpetrators on Trial, Scenes from the Great Terror in Soviet Ukraine. This is a book that deals with members of the NKVD, or the Soviet security police, and their work in the so-called Great Terror. Now, what was the Great Terror? The Great Terror, which is usually dated 1937 to 1938, was a terror that netted some 1.5 million arrests at a minimum across the Soviet Union, as well as something like 700,000 executions. The Great Terror was traditionally seen as only a terror against elites, Soviet elites, and it was that. But the greatest number of victims were victims who were caught up in one of two so-called mass operations. One of the mass operations was called the so-called anti-Kulak operation, or NKVD Order 00447. And that was aimed at not only former kulaks, and that term is a loaded term. It shouldn't be taken literally, but basically meant wealthier peasants. But it was aimed at criminal recidivists. It was aimed at social deviants, so-called, and social aliens. And it could include many, many categories of people. The other mass operation were the national operations. And these were aimed at specific ethnic groups. So if we move now into Soviet Ukraine, Poles and Germans were hit the hardest in these national operations. Certainly their numbers were lower than Ukrainians themselves, but most of the Ukrainians, I think, were picked up in the anti-Kulak operation. So my book follows NKVD interrogators into their work. Now, this is a new source base. It's a very interesting source base that comes out of the former KGB archives in Kiev. These are now called the SBU archives. It's very hard to get sources on perpetrators, and especially in this case, NKVD perpetrators. But at the end of the 1930s, Stalin called a kind of retreat to the Great Terror. In November 1938, he basically halted the mass operations that I just spoke of. And as he had done in collectivization in 1930, he scapegoated lower-level actors for the supposed excesses. Now, let's be clear. The terror hails from Stalin. Stalin is the architect. He is the engineer of the Great Terror. There's no doubt about that. But there is a pyramid of perpetrators, even in the former Soviet Union. And if we go somewhere down the scale of the perpetrators, we begin to see the NKVD. Now, Stalin accused the NKVD, or certain members of the NKVD, in 1938 of violating socialist legality. This was the euphemism that was used. And so something like 1,000 NKVD interrogators were arrested just in 1938-39. But many more, close to 10,000, were dismissed from their positions. And these were the scapegoats. Now, interestingly enough, they leave a wonderful documentary trail, which you'd never expect would have been left. And these are their criminal investigatory files. Now, these files are completely inaccessible in the former KGB archives in Moscow. But in Kiev, the archive has made these files available to researchers, Ukrainian researchers, foreign researchers. And the files are really quite amazing because they not only provide a picture of these NKVD interrogators at work, but they also prove to be a window into the Great Terror in different local settings. And this is something we just had not seen because we didn't have the archives. Now we do. Some of the criminal files can be up to 12 volumes, and these are very hefty volumes. They contain the trials under the military tribunals of these NKVD interrogators. They contain, that is the stenographic records, they contain the stenographic records of interrogations of the people on trial, as well as their colleagues who were brought in to witness, some of their victims, and then a series of experts. And take that word with a grain of salt. I mean, these could be jailers, they could be people higher up in the NKVD, or they could be doctors, prison doctors, or doctors outside of the prison who did autopsies on their victims. So these are really voluminous files, and they open up a whole different way of seeing the Great Terror. So my book is a series of case studies following the terror in different settings. So one setting is a kind of factory town, Zaporozhye, which is a really interesting area to look at because it's a very ethnically mixed population, and it is an industrial town, so these were areas of high sensitivity for Stalin. I also take the reader into the village, and we see what the terror looked like at a local level in Skvira. Then we go to Kiev, as well as Kharkov, and Uman to look at other kinds of settings. So in Uman, you had an inter-district NKVD group, which was responsible for carrying out the terror in a number of areas. In Kiev, I look at the head of the Kiev Oblast NKVD. And then I round out the picture by going to the Republican level NKVD to look at a close colleague of Uspensky by the name of Graber. And we follow his activity during and after the worst of the atrocities of the Great Terror. So this is a really new look at the terror based on sources that simply hadn't been accessible. I can say that Ukraine, along with Moscow and Leningrad, the two capitals, and areas in Siberia, which were big exile areas, were the areas hit hardest by the Great Terror, by the repression. These were also areas that continued to be hit very hard in the second year of the terror, 1938. So, for example, Soviet Ukraine was the only region to get permission to carry on with anti-kulak operation when they requested a raising of the limits. And they were allowed to basically arrest 30,000 more people, an enormous number of people. Ukraine is also interesting because, you know, we're talking about a border area. We're talking about an area with mixed populations. And in 1938, particularly the purge of the defense factories, if you look at Zaporozhye, you get a lot of anxiety over German Russians. Now, these are Russians, actually. They're not Germans, but they're Germans who had been living in Russia, at least from the time of Catherine the Great. But they're often in these defense factories as skilled workers, and they get hit very hard. So the ethnic complexity of the area makes it an area for intense repression. And then, certainly not the least, you have the heritage of Ukrainian independence. And so, you know, this becomes almost mythical in its dimensions of fear for Stalin. In 1937 and 38, you know, everywhere he looks in Ukraine, he thinks he sees Ukrainian nationalists. And so, you know, we have a category within the anti-kulak operation of Ukrainian nationalists, basically, which is very different from anywhere else. And all sorts of people get pulled in under this, including, you know, simple collective farmers, former peasants, who during the Civil War were literally forced to fight on one side or the other. One of the victims who comes to testify in Zaporozhye says, "Look, I had no choice. I had absolutely no choice. I was forced to fight. I only fought 5 days with the Ukrainians, with Petnora." So, these are mythical enemies in many ways. These are not a clear and present danger, but they highlight the extent to which fears of civil war and Ukrainian nationalism lived on in the mindset of Stalin. The composition of the NKVD changes pretty radically in the course of the Great Terror. I look at a third wave of arrests in the NKVD in Soviet Ukraine. But every time the leader of the NKVD fell or was arrested, transferred or arrested, his clients, his patronage network, then fell under arrest as well. They were removed or arrested. And so in Soviet Ukraine, when the terror starts, one of the early victims is the head of the NKVD. And so that's the first purge of the NKVD in Soviet Ukraine. And most of the people arrested are charged with, farcical charges of Trotskyism or counter-revolution. Then this happens again when the second head of the terror era NKVD is removed and eventually arrested. That's Loplevsky. And that follows with a purge in the ranks of the NKVD as well. And that's when Uspensky comes in. Uspensky is the final head of the NKVD during the Great Terror. He comes in from Russia. He was a very senior NKVD leader, and he brings with him his so-called tails. And this is TAIL. But basically, this is his own patronage network. And he staffs a good many of the Oblast NKVDs with people he brings with him, largely from Russia. And he comes to Kiev in February, along with Khrushchev. So these are the new appointments. Khrushchev also gets his first appointment as head of the Communist Party in Ukraine when Uspensky comes in, and the Great Terror revs up for its final phase in 1938. But can I go back to social composition? Because you asked about whether these people were educated. So what we see as we follow the changes in the NKVD in Soviet Ukraine, which one NKVD interrogator described as a kaleidoscope of cadres, you see the educational level decrease. You see the number of Jews in the NKVD decrease. The Russians always remain dominant. There are statistically relatively few Ukrainians in the NKVD in Ukraine. And you basically have a more proletarian composition of the NKVD with some peasants as well. Like a lot of the people that I look at, it's not clear what their backgrounds are. They say peasant, they say worker, and you can be all that because so many peasants moved into the cities at this point in time. But I have a combination of people, mostly with proletarian backgrounds, some with peasant backgrounds. Well, I think it's all of the above. In other words, motivations of perpetrators are, well, first of all, they're very hard to get at because, you can read what is very critical, open, frank testimony at their trials, but you can never fully believe what they say. But what I've tried to discern are a variety of motivations. What I've seen is a variety of motivations. So, there were true believers. There were also cynics. I have one interrogator who I think was a sadist. Certainly his colleagues called him a sadist, and his prisoners were terrified of him. But I think he's in the minority. I don't think most of these are pathological characters. Remember, they're in the NKVD. The NKVD is a military kind of an organization, and so they follow orders. And so when they're on trial, of course, they all refer to what Raoul Hilberg, who was a scholar of Holocaust studies, called the doctrine of superior orders. That is, my boss said I had to do this. The orders came from above, from the Republican level in Kiev or from Moscow. So you see that, and they're right. I mean, the orders did come from above. The architecture is thrust upon the NKVD offices, the local offices, but yet what I would like to argue is despite a variety of motivations, in these NKVD actors' activity, and despite the fact that it's Moscow that's in control, they still literally have the power of life and death over individuals. And it's within those powers that you see a kind of constrained agency where they're able to make some difference, almost never in a positive way, but it's where you see their sort of individual input. And the main problem is Moscow unleashed this terror. And in order to do it, they granted unlimited powers to very limited individuals. And they went with it. But in the end, Stalin was able to pull to call a halt to the Great Terror when he decided it had gone far enough. And it did stop. It did stop. So it's not like the NKVD is out of control. There's no question. It's working under the main sort of infrastructure of the terror as established by Moscow, and slightly altered as it comes to Ukraine and then to Kiev and then out to the countryside. But they do have a certain amount of agency, and what I try to do is to look at their actions in order to imply motivation. But if I can back up a little bit, in 2013, I published an article in Slavic Review, and it was basically a kind of theoretical, broad article on perpetrators, trying to understand the question of perpetrators in the Soviet Union, with the idea that we haven't done much on this topic, mostly because of sources. They simply have not been available. So originally, I was going to look at this question through, first of all, collectivization and the famine. That would be my first theater of violence, to look at perpetrators. Then I was going to look at the Gulag. And finally, I thought, and there was a good deal of bravado to this thought, I was going to go into the interrogation room. Now, how was I going to do that? Well, I was going to try to find sources. But, the one source I could fall back on were Samizdat and emigre memoirs. And they were mostly by members of the Soviet intelligentsia who described their experiences once they were arrested. Now, I was fortunate in that I ran into a colleague who had some similar interests to me, and he had a lot of experience working on the Great Terror in Ukraine. I hadn't. I hadn't worked in Ukraine, and I hadn't worked on the Great Terror. My interest had been mainly collectivization, the peasantry, and for Russia as well. And so he suggested this is Mark Jung, he suggested we go to Ukraine and have a look at sources. And so, I wanted any information on actual interrogators. And lo and behold, this small episode in late 1938, early 1939, that we sometimes call the Purge of the Purgers, yielded an amazing treasure trove of documents. I didn't expect this. I also didn't expect to see these trials of the interrogators, both as individuals and as groups. This really surprised me. I didn't expect that we'd have stenographic reports of their interrogations, as well as interrogations of witnesses. I didn't expect that these trials were somehow considered so important that they were held over and over again. In many cases, the sentence would be overturned and they'd have to go to trial again. Dolgushov was the head of the Kiev Oblast, or provincial NKVD. He had 3 trials. The first trial they overturned as being insufficiently severe. Moscow overturned it. The second trial was overturned as well. His third trial, and I find this remarkable, was held in 1942 after the outbreak of war. The NKVD in Ukraine was mostly relocated into the Urals, and that was where his third trial was held. And it just seems absolutely absurd that this country, undergoing an invasion that made it look like it was going to fall apart at that point in time, is still trying the NKVD officials. And I can't really give you a good answer to that, except that they really took these trials seriously. And I suppose at some level Stalin is sending a message to the NKVD that he has complete control, not that he ever did not. So back to, finding things that were amazing. I mean, all of these documents were amazing to me. The fact that we actually could see autopsy reports of victims were amazing to me. The fact that we had words of, a series of 5 or 6 doctors across all these cases who were visiting, victims of my main characters' violence was quite amazing to me. I didn't expect, not only did I go into the interrogation rooms and in a sense watch how these interrogators worked, you're able to go into the execution chambers. So we found out that usually the head of the executions during this time was the head of the local prison, and he put together a team of executioners, which included a motley crew of people like the NKVD chauffeur, the courier, some jailers perhaps, and these would be the people who would carry out the executions, which generally were held within the NKVD building, generally in a basement. There would be somebody revving an engine, which we've always heard, in the literature, but these people actually talk about how they'd rev the engines. And then we find out about the whole process of the execution and the various stages of basically tricking the prisoners, because there was a directive that prisoners were never to be told of their ultimate sentence if they were going to be executed. So when they were prepared for execution, they were prepared under the reasoning that they were going on etap. That is, they were going on to the gulag. They were getting onto transport to the camps. But of course that didn't happen. They would be checked by the head of the NKVD to make sure that everyone who was going to be executed was really who he was, or who she was in rarer cases. That would be the first stage. The second stage, they would be undressed. They would be told to undress and get ready for the baths, so-called. And the baths were not the baths, but that led to the third stage, the final stage, which was the execution. And usually, in a place like, say, Uman, there would be 40 murders, 40 executions a night, after which they'd pile the corpses literally in cars, put tarps over them, and take them out to the cemeteries for secret burial. Statistics are always tricky, so I think anything that I could give you would be minimum, but I actually would turn to a colleague's work. George Lieber has recently written an interesting and important book on interwar Ukraine, and I highly recommend it, by the way. But he argues that in all, in Ukraine, something like, just short of 300,000 people were arrested, and around 123,000 were executed. Now, it's really difficult, and I am not able to do this. I don't have access to these kinds of sources, and some of my Ukrainian colleagues also find this difficult to estimate the arrest and execution figures for various oblasts in Ukraine, various regions. So I don't have that. And these, again, would just be ballpark figures. Let's say, these criminal files that I look at. The victims of the Great Terror, many of the victims of the Great Terror also had files. They certainly were interrogated. If you were to go back and look at that material, I think quite often it tells us almost nothing, next to nothing, because it was fabricated. So much of the copious paperwork, the charges were fabricated, and much more. I mean, signatures on confessions could be forged as well. Excuse me. So you have to keep that in mind, and that makes the documents that I looked at, these criminal files of interrogators, all the more important, because they're speaking their mind. All of them, when they're on trial, they deny their guilt. But at the same time that they deny their guilt, they admit to an unbelievable number of atrocities, atrocious acts, of course, under the pretext that this was an order. and we thought we were supposed to be doing this, and we thought we were going against the enemy. But they tell an amazing story. And as they tell the story, I think it becomes clear that you really can't trust most of the earlier documentation on victims. And that's not a real surprise, or it shouldn't be a real surprise to researchers. Now, what I have is a view of the terror through the eyes of the perpetrator, right? And so what this means is you get a real sense of process. You get a real sense of how the terror was implemented, even how the message that torture was absolutely fine with the top leadership was circulated through the country. But you don't get a sense of the experience of the victims. So this is not a story about the victims of the terror. I think that story, has been told in general outlines in some of the classics of the Great Terror, the works of Robert Conquest and Roy Medvedev. I still think there's a great deal more now that we can do in the study of victims. Certainly in Ukraine, for example, there's been a tremendous amount done on victims of famine. But I think we're now getting the kinds of sources that we can do victim studies rather than the earlier studies, which were more or less based on a narrow set of memoirs from members of the intelligentsia. So victims really appear in this book very marginally. They're sometimes brought in as witnesses to talk about their interrogators. Well, in Moscow, you can't go near this topic as far as archival research in the FSB archives. That's the name of the former KGB archives in Moscow. I mean, it's just impossible at this point. There were some studies in the 90s and early part of this century that were quite good. The work of Votlin, for example, comes to mind. But now, I don't have the energy to fight with the archivists in Moscow anymore. I've been working in archives for 30 years, more than 30 years. I started in the Soviet period when we were extremely restricted, and that's a whole story in itself. But then things got much better in the 1990s, and we had good access to the state archives and the Communist Party archives, and minute access to the former KGB archives. Ukraine was a whole different kettle of fish. And so we started our work actually before the Euromaidan revolution. And we got a lot of access. So it was a different kind of setup for Moscow. But once the Euromaidan revolution occurred, then things were completely open. And if before, we dealt with fairly friendly archivists, there's no question, with one exception. After, it was just splendid. There were a lot of young people that were brought into the archive, the director and assistant directors, and they've changed a number of times. So I'm not even sure now who's at the top, but they're all very good and very welcoming and encouraging. I mean, they would close the archive, which is probably a bad thing, close the reading room, I should say, for a week when we came down, because this work that we started ended up getting bigger and bigger. So we did a whole project, which in the end will produce 5 volumes. This is apart from my monograph, but we're producing both in Moscow and in Kiev. We already had 1 volume come out, an anthology of the team members' articles, and then we were going to publish 4 volumes of documents based on this project. 2 volumes on the trials, 1 on Communist Party meetings within the NKVD, and then 1 on ego documents. And this is based on teamwork. So our other documents will be coming out in Russian and in Ukrainian. And we felt it important to bring it out in Moscow because that will be the larger readership. And I think it's important that these topics are discussed in Russia itself. I have no doubts that they have been discussed, are being discussed, and will be discussed in Ukraine. So the first volume of articles that we published came out as a book in Moscow, but it's been published in the House Journal of the SBU Archives in Kiev in 2 issues. first of all, I think we need to keep in mind that it took a lot of people to carry out this massive repression in the late 1930s, but throughout the 1930s. And I think we get a very interesting angle on Soviet history if we look at the people who carried out the terror. And it's much wider, of course, than the NKVD. There are many social actors who are involved in one way or another. So I think, the first thing I want people to see is how immense the social participation in this terror was. Social participation, mostly in the sense that people had jobs to do, whether they were in the party or whether they were in the secret police or whether they worked in the Soviets. But there were a lot of people involved, and a lot of people knew about the terror. The news of the terror got out, if only because lower NKVD officials who were participating in executions tried to sell the clothes of victims at the market, and their wives saw them. And then they came and complained. So news of the terror got out. And so I guess I want people to see that this was an immensely complex and intricate operation that certainly started and was due to the initiative of Stalin, there's no question, but that there were a lot of other actors involved. And I think that's important to see. But for specialists in particular, I think, what's important is to demonstrate the value of these news sources and what you can see with them and how you can literally go into the terror by going in through the minds of these perpetrators as they describe in great detail what they did. Okay, well, thank you so much, William. I really appreciate it. It's awfully good of you to do this.